terminally online, cynical, sadomasochistic social power hierarchy thing. When I started speaking out about what I have now come to call an online pseudotherapy cult with spiritual themes, I didn't really know what I was getting into. I never really sat down and went, today I'm gonna do an activism. And to be fair, in hindsight, that's probably a good thing, because had I known what I was getting into, had I known that I'd be effectively opening myself up to like a barrage of constant vitriol and death threats and an unrelenting suspicion of anybody that messages me, I would probably have given it a miss. When I started speaking out, I wanted to tell my story, and while that's kind of mostly in the past for me now, because it's become a necessary part of my recovery to think about other things more and talk about other things on the channel and so on, I'd be lying if I said there wasn't more I wanted to talk about that would require like a similar level of courage, a similar level of like, right, it's time for me to say something. Not about that group specifically, but about, let's call it a certain social climate online, specifically on the left politically, and specifically in sort of social justice, identity politics circles. And, as ever when I talk about this, I have to be very clear. I am very much left-leaning. I have very much sort of democratic socialist values, although somewhat libertarian still. Although I'm probably a lot calmer about it than most people you'd see online. So I'm not, coming at this from a point of view of like, the left are eating themselves and they're all wrong and stupid and suck this libs or whatever people say, But the kind of thing I'm talking about, right? It's this like terminally online, cynical, sadomasochistic social power hierarchy thing. This milieu where cancellation and accountability spectacles are basically what we call public humiliation that's intended to ruin a person's reputation and job prospects in one foul swoop. All at the behest of a mob that is heartily engaged in a game of telephone, and if something can be construed as transphobic or biphobic or homophobic or whatever, any kind of phobic you like, then that's just the truth now. That whole thing. For a long time, I was genuinely terrified of saying anything about this, either, on my channel or on social media in general, mainly because I and others that I know feared having this sort of Eye of Sauron turn on us. Fear of being labelled a transphobe for not only voicing, the acceptable opinions on a certain thing, or fear of being labelled a bigot for not having sort of an up-to-date knowledge of the correct language that's supposed to be used to talk about a certain thing, and an unwillingness to just accept the consensus opinion of whoever you were in conversation with at that moment on how you are supposed to be speaking, and fear of being treated like a reactionary for thinking that there are genuine, real, proper concerns with the hindrances, with the roadblocks that are present in these kinds of milieus when it comes to having a genuine and honest and open discussion about things without getting mobbed, dogpiled, ratioed, or whatever it is. Basically a fear of being pushed out of us and made into one of the impure transgressing them, which should, at this point, if you've been watching this channel for a little while now, that should sound familiar. So going back a few years now, I had the side of my head shaved, and the hair's still growing back, actually, you can see that, look at that. And my own mind had become like an internalized Tumblr all grown up Twitter sphere kind of a thing. My thoughts were rarely distinguishable from these like little snarky tweet length quips that I think we've all seen, complete with vinegary sarcasm and about 4 layers of protective irony. And I was anxious as well, and nervous all the time, and snarkier than I've ever been. And if you know me, you'll know that snark comes very naturally to me. So Christmas 2020, I am sitting on Twitter and I'm arguing the toss with random people about this very, very problematic thing that Richard Dawkins has said. And a lot of back and forth and, compulsory defamatory retweet and a bit of ratioing later. And it becomes abundantly clear to me that the people that I'm speaking to have absolutely no interest in trying to understand where I'm coming from, trying to understand my point of view. They're more interested in making assumptions. They're more interested in assuming that I'm a certain type of person, that I've thought about things in a certain way, and that I've arrived at the conclusion that they think I've arrived at in the way that they think I've arrived at it. And then I had a moment of awareness. Then I had a realization. I was sitting on Twitter on Christmas Day, and admittedly this wasn't the Christmassiest of Christmases. I'd just recovered from COVID. Other people in the house, pretty much everybody in the house, was still recovering from COVID. 2 people were on oxygen tanks, and so it wasn't the Christmassiest of Christmases. But here I was, and I was so angry, so stressed out on fucking Christmas Day. I cannot stress that point enough. So enough was enough. So this was the last straw for me. This was the straw that broke the camel's back. This came after a year of trying to ingratiate myself in and remain part of this sort of social milieu that I had begun to see cracks in a little bit, but it was still important to me to be part of it for one reason or another. And this was during my own continuing cult recovery, which has been, taking place now for 7-8 years, something like that. And in that time, I'd kind of ended up bounding from one ideology to another, and never really figuring out how to actually do this critical thinking thing that I'd heard so much about and that I'd become so passionate about talking about on the channel. It's one of those things that's it's good, it helps, it's a solution to a lot of problems, but whether you're actually very good at doing it or not is another question. And it's only really been, I think, in the last year or so that I've really learned how to do that, actively think critically. But I've talked about that on the channel before, so check out those videos if you want to hear me talk about that more. But suffice to say, just for the sake of this point, it turns out thinking for yourself, critical thinking, is a lot easier when you worry just a little bit less about what everybody else thinks. Which, I realise is easier said than done when compliance is how you avoid the eye of Sauron. I remember talking to my wife once and just being actually, that's transphobic, and I cannot tell you now why I thought that something that she'd said was transphobic. All I remember is that I said that, which I guess, if nothing else, shows you that it's the accusations that stick in your head more, that hang around quite often, more than the reasons that you fling them around. Which I guess speaks to the whole, you remember the bad more than you remember the good thing. And I think, when it comes to something like cancel culture and this whole just sort of really gross, sadomasochistic, identitarian social milieu, I think that goes part and parcel with it. If anything, that's what makes it what it is. If you shout an accusation at someone loud enough and enough people repeat that and believe it, then that's what they remember. They don't remember the other things, or, the very nuanced and down-to-earth and hopefully even-minded and self-possessed response that a person gives to those accusations. You're just going to remember, that person's evil or bad or whatever. Because that's the loud bit, that's the bad bit, that's the bit that sticks in your head, right? So it was a couple of years that I was in these circles online, and it's worth saying that this whole phenomenon, this thing that we're talking about in this video, is primarily an online thing. Although it started to kind of bleed into the real world, it is still very much an online thing. And I think it's made what it is by social media. But while I was sort of in these circles online and watching public figure after public figure, community member after community member dragged through the dirt and had all their impurities and all the skeletons in their closet or whatever dug up by people and sort of shown to the world, and had basically rotten fruit thrown at them while they had their head in the stocks, And all the while this is happening, I'm trying to keep my own problematic thoughts sort of gagged and in the cellar, just out of sight, out of mind, Don't think those things, otherwise you're a bad person. And it turns out exploring those things and really thinking about those things actively was a good thing, and it enabled me to stop kind of using the mob, using the group, using this sort of external yardstick for morality as a substitute for my own actual brain and my own actual ability to think about things for myself. And sometimes I come to the same conclusions, usually not quite as angrily. That's different now. But usually, oftentimes I've come to the same conclusions. So the way that I've described being in this thing, and I've heard other people talk about this in a similar way, but this is the language I like for it most. It's like having a police them in your head at all times. And I say police them because it would never be a policeman, would it? Because man, they're like the bad ones. Men are in the transgressor category, so they would never be a policeman. They would be a police them. And you sort of internalize them. They sort of live in your head and they vet your thoughts and your behaviors and stuff. And so you end up leaning into this sort of protective cynicism, this sort of ironic cynicism. My defense mechanism quite often was to just be so sarcastic that nobody could tell whether I was being serious or not. And I think that's kind of a thing that the sort of Generation Z, the Zoomers, have kind of done as well. There's so much irony in how they approach things. I think that's probably a very similar thing, because you can't cancel someone if you can. I was going to say you can't cancel someone if you don't know whether they're being serious or not, but apparently you can. And the bullshit thing about this was that I was never as fully gung-ho about this as I have been about other things in my life. I was only ever really sort of peripherally involved. And, I never donned the sort of woke white savior cowl or anything like that. Yeah, okay, I looked the part with my they, them pronouns and the shaved side of my head and stuff. But, I never went full identitarian. You never go full identitarian. It has to be said, though, that my sort of questioning my gender and discovering that I'm non-binary was at least in part motivated by my desire to be one of the innocents and not one of the transgressors. You spend very long in these circles and you'll realize that TERFs are second only to the worst kind of human, and the worst kind of human being the sort of the cis het white man. And if you are anywhere close to that, the closer you are to that, the worse you are as a human, right? I think in my case, it was largely sort of ego dystonic. It was largely, I didn't really know that was how I was thinking or what I was feeling. But I think that when you're in a circumstance like that, when you're in a situation like that and you notice things, and we do, we're social species as humans, you notice the way that people are being treated and talked about, and certain signifiers which are signifiers of badness. When you're a human, when you're someone who wants to belong, when you're someone who doesn't want to be cast out and or mobbed, and I have to say I think that's a fairly reasonable desire, then it's understandable that at least part of you might kind of want to maybe find a way, short of leaving, which I think is probably the intelligent choice in a situation like that, maybe the smarter choice of the two. Short of leaving, though, I think it's possible that you might want to find a way to wiggle out of, if you are anywhere close to the cis, het, white, straight man or whatever, you might want to find a way to wriggle out of that category into the category where you're less likely to get mobbed. And by no means is it a safe haven, of course, but I don't blame me, and I don't blame anybody else that would do that, because it's a horrible place, it's a horrible social milieu to be involved in, it's a horrible social climate. So you do what you can in that situation to sort of get by, I guess. In retrospect, I think my unconventional experience of my own masculinity and my sexuality and my troubled childhood and my chronic dissociation as a consequence of that, and being kicked around and taken advantage of by just a few too many absolute dickheads for one lifetime, I think definitely contributed to that. And I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that I don't think I'm the only one that's true of. And there's a whole conversation to be had here about the malleability and the sort of social influence factors on how one identifies and experiences their own gender, but I think that's beyond the scope of this video, although it is something that I've talked about a little bit on my Patreon, which is the place that I kind of talk about stuff that if I don't get to fit something in a video, be it due to time constraints or because YouTube doesn't like you talking about certain things on the platform, and that is definitely the case with a topic like this one, Patreon's a place that I talk about stuff like that on. So if you're the kind of person that likes to support the channels you watch on YouTube and you want a bit of extra content from me every week, then definitely check out my Patreon. There's links to that in the description and on the end card at the end of this video. And full disclaimer, and this is really important for me to say, none of this stuff is me intending to shout down anybody's genuine beliefs, experiences, thoughts and feelings or anything. I'm purely speaking from my own here, and I understand that it takes all sorts to make a world. So, you do you at the end of the day. But what I'm speaking about specifically here, if that's not clear already, and I would worry that I would need to clarify this at this point in the video, but what I'm talking about here is specifically the destructive aspects of this social milieu that we're talking about. So I think we would be lying to ourselves if we were trying to tell ourselves that people wouldn't do kind of messed up things to get by in an otherwise destructive, wholly volatile social milieu. And also, I think we'd be lying to ourselves if we were thinking or proclaiming that this whole thing we're talking about in this video isn't made what it is by kind of troubled people sadomasochistically making their own problems everybody else's. And then anyone who's not like the right level of insecure to be the loudest person in any room they enter just ends up getting caught in the riptide and sort of conforming and cobbling together a new sort of dysfunctional way of surviving in this weird, expanded but destructive family dynamic. Or, as is probably more likely, sort of repurposing earlier dysfunctional coping mechanisms from earlier life, suboptimal circumstances in their earlier life. As they say on Twitter, which makes me sound like a granddad saying that, but take it for what it is. As they say on Twitter, I don't know who needs to hear that, but where's the lie? When you've been in one cult and then you've spent years of your life recovering from that, and then you find yourself in a social setting that is exhibiting some of those same dynamics, you can't ignore it for long. After I'd noticed this, many a heated rant were had at home, but I never had the courage to actually say anything publicly. I did the odd sort of vague post on social media about it, but it was so vague, and people either didn't notice it or it sort of went over their head or whatever. So, I never really had the courage to make my thoughts known, have my voice on this heard overtly and specifically until more recently. For a long time, I felt like the world was just going fucking crazy and nobody was saying anything about it. And then I eventually found a few people that are talking about it, Clementine Morrigan, Molly Francis, to name two. That sort of encouraged me a bit. It gave me the confidence and a little bit of a kick up the arse to actually start talking about it for myself. It took a while for me to get to a point where I had enough courage to actually speak up, to sort of own my own experience, claim my own perspective and speak from it, have a voice, actually choose to voice my thoughts on this overtly and specifically. And eventually I started saying it like it is. I started saying it like I saw it, like this on my Instagram. Later in my life, when all the strangers I bit my tongue to please have forgotten I even exist, I will be confronted by the one I silenced and imprisoned within. Too many times I've said nothing for fear of consequences. Too many times I've kept quiet only to hear someone else voice my thoughts later on. Every time I kick myself for lacking the bravery to speak my mind. Too many times I've said nothing for fear of ostracism, of being misrepresented, of being belittled by people with the hubris to say inane, knee-jerk things loudly. So I've kept my earnest, thought-out things to myself. But if I never speak my mind, what's the point in having it? There will be consequences, but at least when I'm alone with myself, I'll be with a friend. Game over for the voice in my head that second guesses me. Game over for measuring myself by the standards of the mob. All that said, I'm not saying that this whole neoliberal identitarian thing is a cult. I don't think that we should throw that word around willy-nilly, because if we do, it'll stop meaning something. And I think that word needs to mean something. Things can exhibit the destructive dynamics of a cult without being unified under a leader and taking advantage of people and still be worthy of our concern. And I think even for those of us on the left, if not especially those of us on the left, I think there are very good reasons to take issue with something like this. The the fact that it more or less enables really disrespectful and kind of disgusting behavior, for one, and the fact that it kind of enables people projecting their own unexamined and unresolved shit onto everybody else, for another. And honestly, I think it's a shame that people who see the cracks in this thing end up getting dragged to the right when they start to speak out. But then being a dissenter is a lonely and confusing place to be, and it's a place that requires a lot of energy to sustain, I think. And so when a group of people come along, or a few people come along who are like praising your courage and praising the things that you're saying, while signaling to sort of common values, I think it's understandable that somebody would be influenced by that. I'm adamant that won't be me, because I think we need more left voices speaking about this without getting pulled from like one extreme ideology all the way into another. Although it has to be said, it doesn't matter which side of the political spectrum you are on, an extreme ideology tends to do the same thing for the person that's believing in it. So I think we need to do some like genuine examination if we're coming from one and finding the other one appealing. I think it's important to bolster the confidence of dissenting individuals so that we don't end up, you know, falling in line with a whole other destructive ideology and destructive group down the line. So if you want me on your podcast to talk about how non-binaries are destroying language and that they're, you know, one of the four horse thems of the apocalypse, the answer's no. But also, you know, if you're going to call me comrade in the comments section, also no thank you. You know, it's taken me way longer than a year to find the confidence to actually say some of the things I've said in this video, to have the courage to speak up in this way that I've done in this video, in a fun kind of way. I hope you appreciate what I've done here while telling the story of me finding the courage to speak up. It's taken me a long time to get to that point, but here I am. Here are some of my thoughts on this, not all of them, but some of my thoughts laid out for you. There's always more I have to say on topics like this. As I mentioned earlier in the video, you know, there's loads of audio companions up on my Patreon if you do want a bit more from me. Over 30 now, actually, which is a lot of extra content that you get access to straight away on Patreon. So, you know, just saying, if you feel like it. But otherwise, I'm Andy Fellows, and please remember this. If you don't think for yourself, someone else is going to do it for you, right? I think that's so important, and that's something that I want to start saying a lot more, okay? If you don't think for yourself, someone's going to do it for you. But all the while, please be kind and ask good questions, and I will see you in the next one.